And what I'm going to tell you is more about the realities of the power generation process as opposed to specifically rotating machines. And you'll unfortunately have to connect some of the dots yourselves in terms of what that would mean, on the rotating machine basis. Firstly, I need to first do a disclaimer and say that what I'm about to tell you is definitely not Eskom's view. This is, and for that reason you see these nice blank presentation pages. This is definitely not a consolidated view as arrived to by Eskom. These are views that I can share with you based on postgraduate studies I'm busy with, and with regard to being involved for a long time in some of the NERSA groups, and specifically the Grid Code Advisory Committee and things like that. And I've seen quite a bit of evolution taking place over the years with regard to these, and therefore I can to a certain extent talk to those. You'll firstly see that my title is seems to be a bit duplicit in the sense that I'm talking about a utopian, dystopian reality. And let me just put some context to that firstly. Obviously, everybody wants free energy, and everybody is concerned about environmental damage and so on. And therefore, there's a general opinion that renewable energy is the magic wand with which all of these things can be addressed. And to a certain extent, that is obviously true. However, we know that renewables are not always available due to the nature of wind, due to the nature of sun. These sources have a very spiky nature, and as a result of that, somewhere, somebody, am I standing close to this thing, or what is causing the problem? Must I stand back, or what? I've got to hear the whistle, which is, sorry, I just don't want to get you guys into permanent hearing loss or something. Somebody needs to fill up the gaps where the wind and the sun is not doing the generation thing. And that is where legacy machines or conventional generations come in. And that is what Nico has been talking about now. And they are required to fill in seamlessly wherever the gap may appear. And it's not always clear where the gap will appear. So we look at forecasting, and we look at all kinds of things, but the gaps are elusive from a prediction point of view, and it's not always clear where they are. And there's quite a few examples in the world where, despite the best forecasting efforts, gaps appear in places and in spaces in time where the grid was simply not, apologies for that, the grid was simply not able to respond in time, and then they had a major blackout. Now, firstly, I need to tell you about two specific realities. Firstly, there's the renewable reality. Every day, there's a huge peak of power coming from renewable plants, and every day there's huge valley of renewable energy coming from renewable plants. The difference between them, on average, if you do not have large penetration of concentrated solar and battery storage, is typically 200%. In other words, from the average floor level on a day-to-day basis to the average peak value on a day-to-day basis, you have 100% difference between them. So that's quite a staggering number. And secondly, this that you get into perspective is that relates more or less to between 10% of the installed capacity of renewable plants in a region to about 100%. On good days, you can get 100% out of them, and on bad days, you typically do not get less than about 10% out of them. But that still means there's a 200% difference between the floor and the ceiling. On average, it's far worse if you look at the worst case peaks, but on average you can say that. Now compare that to conventional fleets. These are synchronous machine units. Firstly, let me get nuclear out of the way. Nuclear can't really regulate anything. So they are sitting essentially at a base load value, whatever the base load value is. And they will only move in huge, extreme emergency conditions and never else. So you're looking at the normal coal fleet, and the coal fleet would typically have controlled margin wherein they can move and compensate of about 25%, let's say MCR, and they can go up to MCR, they can regulate about down 25%. That's the capability of movement that you're looking at. So that doesn't sound too bad, because if you've got a fairly small number of renewables in your system, then the 25% of a large coal fleet can easily compensate for any gaps that may appear in the renewable space. However, that's obviously not what happens on a day-to-day basis, and it's definitely not what is being projected into the future. So let's look at that for a moment. Sure. Apologies, on my computer I could actually read that, but I see the slide didn't come out very well. Let me talk to it. You don't have to, I'll explain the important bits just now. What this is a graph that was developed by a German firm for the South African gas. So it's not, it comes from a fairly independent source. And what they've looked at here are this line here, this bar here, this one here, and this one here. This is the projected growth in demand from, that is 2060, that's 2020, and that's 2030. So they've looked at that. And these other in-between stacks of things that's going on here, that is the mix of energy that has been projected. Well, they've obviously had to take some artistic license here, because the sources are, there's some government sources, there's some projections and so on, and because there's not the IRPs didn't come out always as was hoped for, there's some guesswork in it, but it still gives a fairly good idea of what we're looking at. So at the moment, everything below that blue is conventional fleet, and the blue then represents all hydro. In other words, on storage and conventional hydro. Now, as you can see, the blue does not really grow significantly over this time window. It more or less stays the same. There is, however, a marked decline in the that color there, which is the coal fleet. This big bar up to that point is coal fleet. Those are existing and non-existing gas turbines, and that is also another form of gas turbines. One is closed cycle, one is open cycle, and you can see there's significant growth in these. But besides that, the part on top there and the part on top there is the renewables, and there's actually two colors there. Your color perception is really good, and one is obviously wind and one is obviously solar. Now, what you can see here is that the total mix, the total growth in that increment there from the current reality, which they have here as 2016, up to the 2030 point, is essentially displacement of other generation values to the tune of about 30%. In other words, there will be some decommissioning foreseen in the coal fleet and in some others, and there'll be a huge explosion in the renewable area. But also very important, and don't underestimate that, is this section at the bottom, which is at least dispatchable because it is gas turbines, but it comes at an enormous premium. So it's a huge benefit in a country which doesn't have a huge hydro peaking capability, but it is very expensive to utilize. Going to the next one from the same report, the German report that I spoke about earlier, I've got this picture. It's not particularly impressive, but the one thing that I want to at least draw your attention to is that where we had normally energy sources on the right-hand side, so-called flexible resources, interesting name that they chose for it, and we've got a grid here and we had a load on the other side, they classify the variable generation, which is essentially renewable, with the same level of unpredictability, or somewhat resembling unpredictability, as what the load is. In other words, it's a huge variable. It's not so much dependable, it's not so much forecastable, it is more a variable, and that's a very important thing to understand. Because of the variable nature of it, and because of the fact that you do not always know when the variability is going to manifest itself. Now, what are the implications of that? If you have a huge growth in renewables, and the contracts, the power purchase agreements are written along the lines as a take or pay principle, which is largely used in South Africa and many other countries, which means that you must always use your renewable energy when it is available, and if you choose not to use it, you will have to pay for it as if you had used it anyway. So you must use it. It's a no-brainer. You've got no choice in the matter. Otherwise, it's energy that you're paying for that you're not receiving. So if you assume that that is the reality, and that is the world in which we're going to find ourselves in the very fairly near future, 2030, where there's a renewable penetration of between 20 and 30%, it means that you must have that some of your traditional units are going to be displaced. So you're going to have to run smaller fleets of conventional units. There's no way out of it, because of the fact that these machines, as I told you earlier, is going to be up to 100% available, it means that there is 180 megawatts variability within a few minutes that you can actually get, and that is huge. But if at its peak supply rate, you have to back down other units, other sources of electricity to make room for that, of course. So you've got a small pool of conventional units staying online, and that smaller pool need to be moved into some of the reserve classes that the grid code is making provision for. Now, in terms of the grid code, we have some legacy issues in South Africa which is dissimilar to other countries. And one of them is that we've got a special reserve class which we call supplemental reserve. Now, supplemental reserve was something that was dreamt up specifically for the South African case with the Machiel coal situation, where there was coal was constrained to the extent that the units were opted for doing part cycle. We call that in Eskom language, we call that two-shifting, which essentially means that you can run a plant during, let's say, peak hours of the day, then shut it down during non-peak hours of the day, and then start it up for peak hours in the afternoon or for peak hours the next morning as the forecast may require. That, however, is hugely expensive and hugely damaging to all plants, not just rotating machines, but rotating machines has not been excluded from the impact. They are definitely impacted heavily. But your entire unit is actually impacted. Your turbine is impacted, your boiler is impacted, the whole thing is impacted very negatively from that point of view. But this reality leaves little option but to move some of those units into this longer-term reserve class that I'm mentioning now. The second implication is that because you've got less and less conventional units synchronized to the grid, you must try and increase your operating range, wherein you can try and control for shortfalls and for frequency and things like that. Now, the easy targets to try and achieve that is, firstly, regular utilization of EL1. EL1 is the emergency class of reserve, and that means essentially that you over-generate over the normal ceiling value of a unit, and that normally means that you've got very limited or almost no control in that specific range, and that you must make use of other methods to try and control frequency and things like that, typically through peaking means. It also means that you must try and reduce your min-gen floor. Now, the min-gen is also a term that is existing in the grid code, and it is defined to be the lowest floor value at which a normal conventional unit can operate stably without taking any abnormal operational actions. So it means that you can move down to the mid-gen floor level without, for example, making use of fuel oil support. Moving below that typically means that you need to take you need to configure your plant abnormally, or you need to take abnormal actions like supporting your combustion process with more expensive fuel sources. That's typically what is implied. And then lastly, on that specific front, is it means that if you have fewer units on the grid synchronized, that you must move to lower floor levels and higher ceiling values than is normal, and it means that therefore you move further away on both the ceiling and the floor level from your optimum point where you have an energy efficiency optimum that you can derive, and which obviously relates to costs of the product and things like that. Another implication that I just need to mention quickly on the EL1, the emergency level 1, which is above the normal ceiling value, means that you automatically have far higher erosion rates. Erosion in typically your boiler, which is one of your major factors that drive outage durations and outage frequency intervals and things like that, goes up to between, let me rather say, is correlated to the third power, anything between the third power and the seventh power of the airflow speed through the boiler. And there's much work internationally being done on that. You need to calibrate it for your own conditions, based on turbulence and laminar flow and things like that. But what goes without saying is that as soon as you start using that, you are eroding the unit far more rapidly, and that obviously detracts from unit reliability. So, fewer units in operation has some implications. There's a smaller control range with regards to both active power and reactive power. Now, the reactive power may seem a bit pedantic, but in cases where we've seen large losses of units where you lose an entire voltage node in a system, the voltage can go down on a local network, let's say within a 200-300 kilometer radius, to up to a depression of up to 30% in voltage on the lower distribution network. So it's significant. You have less total overall inertia in the system. The fewer units you've got, the less inertia you've got, and the models for frequency control and things like that are to a certain extent based on these values. So if you have fewer of them, it also changes your model and your calibration of your control of the network. Your EL1 drives higher maintenance. I've spoken about that already. The lower mid-gen level detracts from the overall unit stability. So if you're running at a lower level, you've got fewer units, but you're in the mid part of the day, there's a lot of renewable energy coming in, you are probably running the majority of your fleet at sub-stable conditions, which means that system disturbances are far more likely to affect those units and could lead to cascade failure and regional blackouts, something along those lines. To compensate for the gaps that now exist with the smaller fleet of machines running, you obviously have a far bigger dependence on peaking generation. Now, I see in the new energy plans, there's all kinds of proposals for not just open cycle gas turbines, but also closed cycle gas turbines. But closed cycle gas turbines, it would be a far stretch of the imagination to call those peaking plants, because I mean the open cycle part already takes to the tune of about 20 minutes, and then you need a lot of temperature time until the closed cycle comes into operation. So that is not peaking in the true sense of the word. That is something that you need to foresaw 6 hours ahead of time for tonight, and then you need to start running them up, and the cost for these things are huge. And then there are some other unique novelties in our grid code, which is not really prevalent in other grid codes in the world, and those relate to what we call unit islanding, which is a special design that we use at the Eskom generating units, which facilitates more rapid restart after a blackout condition, regionally or nationally. what our total exposure to multiple events are, in other words, cascade events that can affect more than just a single unit. So all of these things, and I said etc. because there's actually quite a few of them, and I didn't want to carry on about it, but there's quite a few other things, and these things like islanding are, for example, situated in what we call ancillary services part of the code. Now, just to have a bit of a wrap up on this, what can then be proposed? It needs to be proposed that we will have to have a serious relook, specifically in South Africa, with regard to the ancillary services, but specifically focused to grid-level ancillary services. And why I'm saying that is, for example, the whole issue of inertia need to be considered in this. There's many suppliers of renewable plants that fund things like artificial inertia, and it is quite impressive if you really read the literature on it. But you should never forget that those things are embedded at distribution level networks. And after you've used the transfer function to transfer it to the transmission side, its effectiveness on grid level is not very high. So although you may invest a lot of money to try and get it, it's probably not worth very much. So we'll need to go and specifically look at grid level support from things like inertia. Reactive power and specifically synchronous options need to be considered. We as an industry worldwide have moved away from synchronous condensers, synchronous reactors and things like that. But that is probably the way that we'll have to go if you want to get sufficient levels of inertia back. And we need to re-explore that and not just be bent on the novelties that fax machines and those things promise. There's the possibility to look at startup and shutdown costs for ancillary services, because if you're going to do, if the higher penetration of renewable energy is going to force you to shut down and start up units more regularly, the costs that are associated with that need to be footed somewhere, of course. And then we need to probably relook at longer term reserves and see what investment from a country point of view needs to be made at those levels to balance the benefit of something like that against the import of hydropower from maybe elsewhere, something along those lines. And that's it from my side. Thank you very much.